Ok, bienvenidos todos a la primera sesión del Seminario Permanente de Teorema. Esta oportunidad estamos empezando en el 2022 con una presentación de Sally Haslanger. Ella es profesora de filosofía en MIT, es profesora en filosofía y también en el Departamento de Estudios de Género. He publicado muchísimas cosas en metafísicas, epistemología, teoría feminista, teoría crítica de raza, y bueno, uno de sus libros más conocidos es Resistiendo la Realidad, y también tiene una serie de libros coeditados de distintos readers sobre distintos aspectos de feminismo y metafísica. Entonces ella lo que Sally nos va a presentar va a ser un paper sobre el tema de la ingeniería conceptual, así que le dejo el esto a ella. Pero si alguien tiene preguntas durante la charla, creo que, Sally, would it be alright if people raise their hands?
Yeah, as long as you, because I'm going to share my screen, and so it's hard for me to tell who's, so you're just going to have to interrupt me, or write in the chat, because I'll be able, I'm not sure actually if I'll be able to see the chat. Will I be able to see the chat? I don't know. Maybe when I'm presenting, I can't see the chat, but just interrupt me.
Okay, so just people can just unmute themselves too. Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Ok, entonces si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, simplemente puede prender su micrófono y es bienvenida a hacer su pregunta. Entonces con eso arrancamos. So please, Sally. So it's an honor to have you here.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation and all of your input. And I should mention my partner Stephen Yablo is here, and as I mentioned to some of you, we're co-authoring a paper on conceptual engineering that sort of moves us forward beyond all of this, and so he's here to sort of get a better feel for where I've come from, so that we both together have a better idea of where we're going. Anyway, so it's fun to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Feel free to either raise your hand and Nurit will be able to interrupt me, or you could just say, wait, I have a question. Great. Okay, here we go. Sharing my screen. Okay. All right. So, title slide. So here's the outline that of material I'm going to cover. I'm going to start off with an introduction that situates this project within my views about, language, thought, and politics, culture, practices, all of that kind of stuff. And then I'm going to introduce an approach to concepts, conceptions, and orientations. I'm going to look at different forms of conceptual amelioration, particularly epistemic and semantic. And, if my cursor is going too slowly, so sometimes it doubles up. And then I'm going to raise the standard question, but wait a minute, how can you change the content of a concept and have it still be the same concept? I'll say a little bit about that. I'll then talk about, as a response to that, how concepts function in social systems, and then I will draw a conclusion. See, it did it again. It insisted I do it twice. Okay. So the first is language, thought, and politics. So I have been developing over the last number of years an account of social practices as the kind of fundamental building block of the social world. To get the idea of this, it's helpful to start with the basic idea that coordination around resources, that is what I call, resources or things of positive or negative value, is a fundamental human task, and our ability to develop flexible forms of coordination that can be passed down through social learning is the key to our evolutionary success. Now, in English, the term resources tends to have a positive valence. People tend to think of it as a good thing, but in the tradition that I'm working in, starting from Anthony Giddens, resources can also have negative valence. So toxic waste is something that we have to coordinate around. And so that is going to get thrown into resources, as well as food and other sorts of good things. So coordination relies on meanings, symbols, default assumptions, and associations that is culture, or what I call a cultural techne, to shape our behavior. Now, the word culture is a word with lots of associations and lots of different uses and meanings. So I've used the more technical term cultural techne because I want you to think of culture as a set of tools. It's a set of tools that we rely on, and it is not the sort of thing where you can talk about American culture or Peruvian culture. It is a set of tools that are kind of fragmented, and I'll talk more about those. So, for example, in our coordination, we not only learn what is edible, but we develop cuisines, menus, and daily and holiday rituals. So, for example, this is a cedar waxwing, my favorite bird, and cedar waxwings are pre-programmed to eat little red round things. Holly berries they love, other kinds of berries, but if you take some plastic beads and throw it on the ground, the cedar waxwing will try to eat them. The cedar waxwing didn't have to learn from its parents what to eat. It has that pre-programmed. But humans, we have to learn what berries are edible and what berries are not from our parents. So this is the passed down through social learning as opposed to passed down through evolution. So on my account, an ideology is a cultural technique gone wrong. It obscures or distorts what is valuable and or organizes us in unjust or harmful ways. So our coordination system is problematic, and the reason why is the cultural technique has gone wrong. That's when it becomes ideological. So any human behavior is constrained by multiple factors. Continue with the food and cuisine idea. Here's a meal. It is constrained by the physical demands of the human body, the geographical context and the edible things in it, the social, political, and legal context that makes certain edibles salient, available, and safe. So, federal councils or organizations or parts of the government that determine what is, like, we have a part of that, what counts as food and what can be sold as food, et cetera, but also treaties that allow for trade, et cetera. Economic constraints on what we can afford, and the social meaning of different foodstuffs. So, for example, when Donald Trump was president, he invited the Clemson football team to come to the White House for a big celebration of their winning the NCAA tournaments, championship, and he fed them Burger King. And this was thought to be ridiculous, and it violated the social meaning of a celebratory feast at the White House. And so this can happen all the time. You serve the wrong thing, or people misunderstand the kind of event it is because of what you're serving. And of course, clothing and everything else has social meaning too. Okay, so public meanings are internalized as we learn the languages of our local cultures. This is the basis for our fluency in social skills and our capacities for code switching. So I share some cultural tools with philosophical colleagues across the globe. So if I give a talk, whether it's in Hong Kong or in Germany or in Scotland, we all have these cultural techne that for philosophy talks where we kind of know how to do it. And no one is tremendously surprised. Others I share with my neighbors who wouldn't know what to do at a philosophy talk, and still others with my dogs. Dogs are very good at social learning, and we train them so that we coordinate with them. And hand signals, verbal signals, all those sorts of things are part of the cultural technique we share with our dogs. So tools that are designed for one purpose are used for other purposes, including critique. And this comes from Levi-Strauss had this idea of a bricolage or bricoleur as a handyman. And so just as you can use a screwdriver to screw in a screw, you can also use it to open a paint can. And the same is true with the cultural technique. Sewell says, Sewell is one of my great inspirations. He's a social historian who wrote mainly on the French Revolution. He says users of a culture will form a semiotic community in the sense that they will recognize the same set of oppositions, or we could call meanings, and therefore be capable of engaging in mutually meaningful symbolic action. To use the ubiquitous linguistic analogy, they'll be capable of using the grammar of the semiotic system to make understandable utterances. So the point here is that social meanings function quite like, though somewhat different, quite like linguistic meanings, but they're meanings that are not necessarily verbal or written in the linguistic form. They might mean be a gesture or a particular way of serving food or a particular kind of food, or even things like pink means girl and blue means boy. And I think that like language, where there are supposedly analytic connections between meanings, there are connections between these symbols, the social meanings. So I don't believe in analytic truths, but there are background default assumptions that are carried when we use these meanings. Okay, so here we are trying to coordinate, and here's a picture. I'll get to the more verbal expression of it. So here's a bunny. The bunny is a resource. We have available to us various social meanings that are dominant in different contexts. So we could interpret that bit of the world, the bunny bit of the world, as a pet, or as food, or as a pelt. And so these public social meanings are available to us to coordinate with each other. Now we internalize certain of them. So around here in Cambridge, you would never consider a bunny as potential food or pelt. You would potentially interpret it as a pet or as a wild animal, I don't know, but pet would be a more likely than food or pelt. And so that is when you encounter a bunny, you're not going to go after it and try and kill it and eat it, or take its fur. And so we internalize the schemas that are relevant to our coordination around here, and that manages what we perceive, what we remember, what we pay attention to, what kind of affect we have, whether we're afraid of it or whether we're, want to go up and pet it, etc. And once that filtering happens, whatever gets through, the information that gets through that filtering, we use to form attitudes. We're then guided by those attitudes to interact with the resources. So for example, people around here, they breed bunnies to be sweet pets, to not run away, to sit on your lap, to be fat and, warm or whatever. And that reinforces that the social meaning is the right social meaning. So there's a kind of looping effect there. Now this can happen in the face of other stimulation, information. So here's a woman. Is she a friend? Is she a mother? Or is she a sex object? There are different contexts which will prompt different responses to her based on the local practice, the local ideology. Similarly, for a Black man, is he a friend? Is he a janitor? Or is he a criminal? So putting all this together in a statement, on my view, social practices are patterns of learned behavior that, at least in the primary instances, enable us to coordinate as members of a group in creating, distributing, managing, maintaining, and eliminating a resource due to mutual responsiveness to each other's behavior and the resources in question, as interpreted through the shared meanings, cultural schemas, cultural techne, etc. Okay, does anyone want to stop here and ask a question?
I had a quick question, I think, which is just about the meaning of social meaning. I don't know if you could just say a little, like, in my head, it's like, I'm just thinking of like semantic meaning in the sense of semantics, and clearly that's not what social meaning is. So you could just say a little bit about the relationship between both.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's that different. So pink means girl. Okay, so that's not so different from P-I-N-K means girl, right? So there's a fairly straightforward set of cases where, red means stop and green means go. We just are not using language in the narrower sense of language. So those are paradigm cases. But you also have in the frame of social meaning, you'll have default assumptions like bachelor is an unmarried man, so you link bachelor with unmarried and with man and things like that. So likewise, in the cultural techne, you will have default assumptions about the particular meanings that are associated with a particular apparatus. So the apparatus in this literature I'm talking about, the apparatus is like the bits of language or the colors or etc. like that. That's the apparatus, and it has meaning. And then there's these linkages between the meanings. And I think that that's all remains quite cognitive, but the way I'm trying to develop this is you think about the communication that is made available through these meanings by relying on a common ground. So if you think of Stalnick-Aryan common ground, you will have some of these default assumptions in the common ground. And then, so for example, if it's, let me give you a more simple example. So it's really important for people to use the right gendered pronouns for infants, but you can't tell the difference between male and female infants. So that people put pink bows on them or they dress them in blue or something. There's a background assumption that use he pronouns for infants that are dressed in blue, right? That's part of the common ground. Use she pronouns for infants that have pink bows in their hair. That's part of the common ground. And so when we are communicating and when we're trying to negotiate the social world, we're drawing on this broad common ground that we have. But the common ground on the view that I'm trying to develop, and Ray Langton has talked some about this, isn't just about what you should believe, because notice it's like what you should do. You should use feminine pronouns, but it's also sometimes even how you should feel, how you should, so, toward the bunny, you feel friendly toward the bunny rather than aggressive toward the bunny, like you're going to kill it. And that too is going to be part of the common ground. That's part of the kind of social common ground. So a lot of what I'm thinking about here is sort of in that space that is some pragmatics and some semantics, and the linkages between semantics and pragmatics. Nurit, does that help?
Yeah, quite a bit. Thanks.
Okay.
Jaime, did you have a question?
Yes. Yes, I would like also some clarifications to make sure that I'm following the concepts here. So plausibly there is some kind of non-social world, like this thing is a rabbit, for instance, right? Mm-hmm. Yep. And then on top of it, you can think of that thing as a pet. So you're assigned this concept of pet. And then you can build practices around the fact that that thing is a pet, right? But in other cases, you can just have that thing being a rabbit and practices around the fact that it is a rabbit. So are those two cases, like, they both fall under your idea of social practice and social meanings, or are they like very different? I know.
Well, I guess it would depend on so the way I understand resources, so there's things in the world, there is the bunny in the world, and that bunny comes to have social meaning when we interpret it in a way that it has either positive or negative, it's a resource for us, basically. So think about penicillin. Penicillin was, is a mold that used to grow on all kinds of things. And it was considered a negative thing, right? You didn't want that mold on your food. And so you threw it away. But then it was discovered it had antibiotic properties. So it became a positive thing. So you began to feed it to people who were sick, whatever, like that. Now, there is this thing, penicillin in the world, but penicillin in the world is taken up as a socially, either in these two cases as a positive or negative thing. And when it's taken up, it becomes a resource, right? A positive or negative resource. Now, if you want to say, well, penicillin isn't either a good or bad thing, it's just a biological phenomenon. Okay, then I'm going to say, well, it's taken up by the biologist in the domain of science as something to be studied, something to be explored, as an object of a biological inquiry or something like that. So there are all kinds of things in the world that, you know, we don't notice, we don't take up into our practices, etc. But it's as we take them up into our practices that they become resources, positive and negative resources. Does that make sense?
Yes. So you would include both. I think that the distinction I was trying to make is just cases where you clearly have a concept under which the thing falls, right, and then you organize practices around that concept, like being a pet. And cases
right,
where you don't really have like a concept for the thing, you just assign meaning to the thing kind of directly. I don't know if that makes sense. But
yeah. So this is a hard question for me, because I think I'm tempted to go two ways. One way I'm tempted to go is, if we care enough to have a word for it, then there's a reason why we're paying attention, right? There's some salience it has for us, because, you know, the world is, when we look out in the world, there's so much information that is potentially available there, but we only take in certain amounts of information, and we take in that information because there's, you know, something relevant to the thing that we've taken up, for somebody anyway, because they gave it a name. And so there's a part of me that's inclined to say there is no sort of there's nothing that we would ever be able to engage with in a substantive or meaningful way that isn't already sort of marked by our cultural techne and taken up into practice in some way. I mean, even if it's leave it alone, right? Because, you know, it's completely pointless or worthless. It's given some kind of place in the social domain. So there's a temptation I have to go that way. But then I want to acknowledge that our visual systems, for example, notice edges and track certain kinds of bodies in the world, even if they're not important or significant or meaningful. I just think that most of the time we don't have the energy to put a lot of attention into that stuff, you know, because we're just trying to cope with daily life and getting along and coordinating with each other. And so in principle, I can allow that there's that kind of stuff, but it's not. You know, rabbits were noticed because, you know, they eat the stuff in the garden, or they're worthy, they're edible, or things like this. That's why we have words for rabbits, I would think. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm kind of torn on that, and I don't know how much rests on that.
Yeah, no, that definitely helps. Thank you.
Any more questions, comments? Okay, I'll keep moving forward. Okay. So much social change is triggered by natural disasters, wars, migration, pandemics, technological advances, economic booms and busts, but some change occurs because the conceptual or symbolic frame for coordination changes. And I think this material and cultural change that goes hand in hand. And that's understandable because the resources are part of the practices. So if the resource changes, if bunnies, you know, all die out, then we're not going to eat bunny for dinner, right? That's a material source of change in our cuisine, say, because they died, right? You don't have any. But there's also can be, oh, people come along and say, you can't eat bunnies. Bunnies are sweet, they're our pets or something. So you can have change that, I mean, one of the things that's important about my view is because practices have these two dimensions, you can promote change in practices by fiddling with at least those two, and also personal attitudes and such. So So what does the process of cultural change, as it changes in the symbolic and conceptual resources, involve? Oh, come on. What are we doing when we come to understand that race is not a biological kind, but a social construct? Do we change what it is to be married when we recognize same-sex marriage? Have we replaced our old concept of marriage or of race with a new one? Or has our understanding of marriage or race simply evolved? So in response to oppression or injustice, we must collectively change the social structures. And of course, that requires more than thinking differently. And today I'm going to focus on the project of challenging the cultural techne, specifically the conceptual and symbolic tools it affords. And one way of doing that is through conceptual amelioration. So I've recently argued that one form of conceptual amelioration is epistemic and another is semantic. So here I'm going to review this distinction and argue that at least one form of semantic amelioration on functional grounds, is coherent and sometimes valuable, but I'm not going to talk about how to distinguish an improvement or merely a change or a making worse. Because when there's change, it could be for the better or for the worse. So I'm just going to talk about whether and how it's possible. Now, one reason this is so important, I think, is that sometimes activists want to insist that we're not simply undermining old practices and replacing them with new ones, because you get a lot of backlash there. In the movement for marriage equality, same-sex marriages are marriages as legitimate as any ever were. So you don't want to have, in response to someone who says, well, you're just changing the terms, you're just pretending like it's still marriage, but it's really not marriage or something. And I want to be able to say, no, these are marriages as legitimate as the others were. And we're just improving our understanding of what marriages are, for example. And we should also interpret history as continuous with our current conditions. So race has been constructed over centuries with cultural tools that deflected attention from social reality. And this is still happening today. So sometimes what we're doing when we're doing conceptual amelioration is looking at what was really happening all along. Whoops, sorry, my cursor is horrible here. Okay, it's sometimes difficult to defend the idea that we're not just simply discarding our old ways and imposing something new. And contemporary philosophy can hinder us because it's so resistant sometimes to conceptual amelioration. So for example, in Canada, when same-sex marriage was being considered by the legislature, there were public hearings and philosophers testified that marriage was analytically between one man and one woman. And so to allow for same-sex marriage would be to change to no longer have marriages. And I think that we ought not to do philosophy in a way that allows people to credibly say things like that. Okay, so here is an approach to concepts. What are concepts anyway, and how are they related to social meanings and ideology? So on the view that I have taken up, it's very much a Stolnikerian externalism. The informational content of a concept is a partition of possible individuals. So a partition of possible dogs is just all the actual and possible dogs, the flurry, slobbery, barky ones in our lives, plus the ones that have existed, will exist, and only ones we imagine. So on the left-hand side of the image, those will have, just pretend dogs, imaginary dogs, or whatever, dogs in fiction, etc., and also our pets and friends. More specifically, the content of the concept is our partition of logical space. So the content of a concept dog will be a function from the world to a set of individuals in that world. Now, what is it to possess a concept? Roughly, for an individual to possess, in the most minimal sense, a concept of X is to have a cluster of capacities that enables them to process information about X's. So possible dogs, there's a child and a vet, and they both are able to process the distinction between dogs and houses, between dogs and I don't know, cantaloupes or something like this. And so they have, in the minimal sense, a concept of X. And of course, they make mistakes. You don't have to be perfect at it. And the kid probably won't be able to distinguish a dog and a wolf, but there is at least a basic set of capacities that on the basis of which we say they possess the concept of dog. So possessing a concept is a matter of having dispositions toward a space of possibilia. It's not something in the head. So we have access to partitions of logical space through different modalities from different vantage points and at different levels of granularity. From a psychological point of view, possession of the concept may occur by virtue of different cognitive mechanisms and give rise to different dispositions in different individuals. So that is to say, conceptual skill comes in different forms and degrees. So here's the vet, and the green line as before is just the minimal possession of the partition, the dog partition. But the blue lines are going to be the more sophisticated capacity. So we can share the concept of X. We both have the capacities to process information about X's, but we differ in how refined or idiosyncratic our capacities are. So different individuals who share the concept of X form different conceptions of X. So the vet, the black dotted lines, will have a lot of information about something in a small part of that partition of logical space. Worlds over there, she may know an awful lot about that, where the child knows nothing about that. And all of the child's assumptions and et cetera, about dogs are going to be about these kind of central cases of pets in that neighborhood. So individual conceptions of X will be idiosyncratic, but concepts are crucial not just for thought, but also for communication and coordination. So your capacities for attention, categorization, interpretation, memory, language, inference, affect, and the like are marshaled for the purpose of coordinating and refusing to coordinate with others in response to information. And to be conversant with the concept of X in a context C, one must be able to process a subset of information about X's that is socially approved in C. So this is connected to Putnam's views about tiger and beech and elm. So around here, to know that something is a tiger, you have to know it has stripes. But to know that there's a distinction between beeches and elms, you don't have to be able to, decide on the basis of observation of a tree in your yard whether it is a beech or an elm. That's not required. So this idea, he called these paradigms. And what I'm suggesting here is the context is going to require a certain level of understanding and a certain kind of information that will count as appropriate for that context. So those who are conversant with a concept in a context have an approved orientation that privileges certain exemplars, features, and responses. And this is what I was talking about a little bit ago, the common ground. So there's a kind of common ground that you need to have when you're entering into a particular context that will enable you to be fluent and to be conversant with the communication and the meanings and such like that in that context. So the vet will have very different demands when she's at work and when she's communicating with her child. So we sometimes introduce different words to pick out the same partition of logical space. Vets might use the term canis familiaris in certain contexts, which is the Latin word for domestic dog, and reflecting the context of inquiry. And Yalcin makes this point, I think, with respect to the distinction between water and H2O. For example, he says, the former water concept might, inter alia, be understood as embedding the partition into a subject matter reflecting parochial human interests and concerns, one including, say, the subject matter beverages, so that with the concept water, we locate that stuff amongst the beverages, while the latter, H2O, embeds it in some part of the subject matter of chemistry, so that with the concept H2O, we locate that stuff amongst the chemicals. So the image at the top is suggesting that water and H2O is both a beverage and a chemical. But when we call it H2O, we're kind of locating it in the blue sort of chemicals. And when we call it, oh, sorry, that was the other, we call it water, we're locating it in the blue beverages, you know, part of the subject matter. I mean, the subject matter of beverages. And when we call it H2O, we're positioning it in the green space of chemicals. Whoa, wait a minute. The subject matter is plausibly delimited by a set of questions that arise in inquiry and in relation to our practical concerns. That's, I'm drawing on Yolson in particular here. Okay, so now we've got some space to talk about conceptual amelioration, but does anyone want to ask me questions about this approach to concepts and conceptions?
I have one, but I don't know if anybody, no sé si alguien tiene alguna pregunta. Yo voy a hacer una, si no, pero si alguien que no ha hablado quisiera ir primero, bienvenido, bienvenida. Okay, yeah, so I had just a quick question about when you first, so I was imagining somebody seeing the case of the veterinarian and the child, and so like the intuitive story to tell is that they have different concepts of the same X. And I was imagining somebody saying like, no, like they have different concepts of different things out there. They have different partitions. And that seems like a not helpful, like of course we can carve things out that way, and sure, they're gonna end up having different concepts of different things. And that doesn't seem like the most helpful thing to do, but I'm not quite clear on like why we would like, why this other way of partitioning things is the correct way, or like how it's, because my intuition is also that this is the right way to do it, but I don't know if my question makes sense.
So I guess it seems to me that when we want informational content to be as the basis for our uses of the word dog in English, we can't expect, we want us all to be talking about dogs, right? The vet and the child and everybody, we're talking about dogs. And we can't, if we say, well, no, the vet is saying something different or thinking something different than the child, then there's going to be not necessarily failures of communication, but it's not going to be as clear that we're talking about the same thing. We're just talking about the things on this side of the partition, right? On this side of the division. And so it seems to me that, I mean, I guess there's two ways of thinking about it. One is dog is very general. It's a very general term that encompasses a whole ton of things. And we want it to, and that we capture that by saying that it just captures this partition. Another is for the purposes of communication. We want us all to be talking about the same set of things. But we partition it in much more sensitive and sophisticated ways. So in the paper, I think I talk about the Yolson and Stolnicker idea of William III talking about war. And the question is, did William III was William III able to imagine or talk about a nuclear war and cyber war and all of that just by talking about war? And there is a temptation to say, well, no, we have the same concept of war that William III did, but there was not the technology when William III was around about how to engage in that war. So he was not sensitive to those distinctions, but now that we have that technology, we can be sensitive to the distinctions, but it's a set of distinctions in the category of war. And we don't have to say, oh no, he wasn't talking about the same thing we're talking about. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps quite a bit. Thank you.
Okay. Are there anything else about?
Yeah, a very quick,
go ahead.
Very quick clarificatory question about your notion of concept. So when you introduce the notion of concept, you talk about a partition. And I was thinking, okay, so she's talking about content. Ways,
Informational content.
world. Oh, I see. Because I think I heard later you said the informational content of a concept. And and that would presuppose, or at least it suggests to me, that you are distinguishing between concepts and the informational content of a concept. And then I was wondering, what's the difference between those two? Or maybe I miss something.
So what I'm thinking of is that the content is the partition, and the concept is a set of dispositions to respond to that content.
I see. Oh, and dispositions are just like psychological things, part of psychology.
I mean, they can be physical. I can have a physical disposition to recoil, in response to a spider. I can have I don't know. I mean, I do think of concepts in this sense as fine-grained, right? Because we need some kind of fine-grained distinctions in addition to the coarse-grained informational content. So the way I'm thinking about it is that on the externalist view of content that we've got here, it's very coarse-grained. And so what we need is a more fine-grained way to talk about our access to that content. And this is going to be important for all kinds of purposes in, so you don't have to have logical omniscience, and you don't have to have, many of the things that come up when you don't have something more fine-grained in relation to the content. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so it's so this is what I see as, if you're a Phrygian, then you can have senses that are fine-grained and reference that are coarse-grained, something like that. But if you get rid of senses, then you need something else that's going to be more fine-grained. But I don't want to insert another thing that is an intermediary between us and the world. I want there to just be us and our dispositions to the world. That help, Eduardo?
Yes, thank you.
And to be completely honest, I don't know how invested I am in this approach. It's more a kind of proof of, I think it helps me think about these things. And also I'm in a department where this is common ground. And so I get help from people who, when I'm trying to figure something out, they say, oh, you do it this way. And I go, okay, good. I now understand how I could do it. Very likely, if I were in a different place, I would think about it differently. This is sort of like Jerry Cohen on the analytic synthetic distinction. I'm at MIT, and so we don't believe they're analytic truths, and we go for Stalnicherian externalism. Okay. Okay, here we go. Okay. So in the case, just as I was just showing you, we're going to talk about epistemic, and then we're going to talk about semantic. So in the case of epistemic amelioration, we improve our understanding of the informational content. And I have to say that when I first wrote my gender and race paper in the mid-90s, and it was published in 2000, I didn't have all these distinctions in mind, and I didn't have a way of saying what I'm saying now. So if you think it was really confusing and I didn't mean this before, you're right, because I didn't know what I meant before. I was confused. So here's an effort to make it clearer. So we improve our understanding of the informational content. So for example, water and H2O. We refine our concept based on broader and deeper knowledge of the phenomenon by gaining empirical knowledge, undertaking in other contexts, conceptual genealogy, developing insight into logical space at a more fine-grained resolution, right? So we, in the case of water and H2O, that we refined our understanding of what water is by doing science. In other cases, so for example, if you're doing a moral philosophy and you're worrying about, what is a person, then you're going to be exploring the far reaches of that partition of persons and say, oh my God, look up here, there are robots who are persons or whatever like that, or there are mutants that are persons. And so but you might explore that different logical space beyond what we need to just get along in ordinary life. Okay, go back here. Experiential access. Sometimes we improve our access to the informational content, gaining more reliable or illuminating access by different modes of presentation. So in this, I think that, if you've never experienced snow, you don't think of water. You don't have a responsiveness to snow as water. But if you may have an opportunity to do that through further new experience. Okay, so in the informational or semantic amelioration, we change what partition of logical space the term or the concept represents. We improve the resources available to track truths. For example, so when we discover race as a socio-historical kind, we might have a different judgment of who is white and who is non-white, because we have seen, we're not just looking at people's genetic profile, which we would find nothing. I mean, I think this is this picture, that picture. If we were just looking at the genetic profile of people, there is no meaningful distinction between whites and non-whites, genetically speaking. But when we see it as a socio-historical kind, we see, oh no, there are some people who are privileged by reference to the being marked and visibly as light skin, straight hair, et cetera, et cetera. So what we mean can affect what we do. So what there is to track, and changing the terms of coordination may be practical and call for refiguring social space. So we may want to change the partition that that is the content of our concept or the content of our language, because we are needing to coordinate, and we realize that there are certain things that are properly part of the content that we didn't include before. So, I mean, lunch in English, it used to be a light meal of any time, day or night, and now lunch is just during midday. Marriage is another one, piety may be another. So, and another side of it is our moral concepts our concepts can affect our moral orientation. So what is morally salient, and we may have a result, change as a result. So marriage, I think, is one of those cases where it's both practical, but it's also a moral consideration of what counts as marriage. Okay, but here's the objection. Isn't content essential? So how is this semantic amelioration possible? If informational content is essential to a concept, then semantic amelioration is impossible, and the best we could hope for is concept replacement, because the information, you can't change the informational content because the content defines what the concept is. It settles what the concept is. It's the concept of dog where the informational content partition is essential to it. Concept replacement is compatible with retaining the word for a new content. So replacement could be masked. So maybe what we're doing is just saying, well, we're going to now call same-sex marriages marriages, But really, that's just kind of a sleight of hand, because we've really replaced the concept, and we're not admitting it. But the question is, can the content change while it remains the same concept? Can we have the same concept marriage, but it go from say only opposite sex marriages to same-sex marriages? Well, concepts provide us with orientations toward logical space. That's what I've just argued. And they should be dispositions that are apt for the content and also apt for the function they serve in coordination, right? Because the point of them, as I was talking about at the beginning, they're part of our cultural techne. We're supposed to be responding to the world and have dispositions to the bunny, to the couple, to the food, but we should have dispositions that also function to enable us to coordinate. So there are these double roles that concepts have. So, and they do change. So consider the meter. The meter, and I'm sorry it's too fuzzy to really read, but that's the best I could do online, getting a picture of it. The concept of meter, the definition of meter has changed multiple times through history. And it's plausible to say, well, the concept of meter hasn't changed in the sense that the meter as a tool of measurement still functions in the same way and enables us to coordinate and build houses and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the informational content, the partition of meter length things that it picks out has changed, right? There's slight differences in what counts as a meter over these different changes in the form and the way it is measured. And nobody says, oh, sorry, no, that can't be. Okay, so then the question is, why bother with the concepts if what we're really trying to do with language is pick out things in the world? Well, I think concepts are not simply cognitive placeholders for content. They provide us these orientations at different levels of granularity. They highlight features of the content in response to questions. They situate content in different subject matters and mandate a cluster of inferential and affective responses. So these aspects of concepts should carry weight in individuation. It's sometimes more important, in fact, to the individuation of a concept that it be included in a particular subject matter and embedded in the relevant set of practices. And I'm going to give you a picture in a second on Yeltsin on water and H2O, then that it maintains its exact informational content. So concepts are there for us to use in practices because there are these kind of dispositions to be responsive to each other and to the world. And it's more important for us to maintain that for the purposes at issue than it is to have the precise content maintained. And so in these cases, we should say that a change in content is compatible with the continuity of a concept. Okay, so here's, remember the picture of water in beverages and water in and chemicals. And it may be that if we think of water as a beverage, then not all H2O is going to be water, because polluted, toxic H2O doesn't count as a beverage. And so we may have, water and H2O pull apart. Okay, so some people want a rule for what we do and how we proceed when we're trying to figure out whether we've maintained the concept and changed the informational content or when we haven't. How do you decide when, is marriage, is it a new concept now that we've added same-sex couples, or is it not? And I want to say that the very point of introducing concepts over and above meanings is to do justice to the different ways we access content and our different dispositions. To ignore those differences in considering the individuation of concepts would be to sacrifice what we have gained. But I'm not going to propose an algorithm to guide us in deciding when and how to ameliorate. The decisions are a matter of judgment and are sensitive to a broad range of considerations. And we encounter them not just as theorists, but as agents engaged in historically specific practices. So sometimes there's a thread in a history of use, in a history of our dispositions that is important and central, and we maintain that. And because we maintain it, we count it as the same concept. But sometimes, it's a kind of very tiny little bit of that history. And so we say, no, sorry, it isn't maintaining the same concept. But I don't think there's some kind of rule for how to decide when we have and when we haven't. The question is how we should go on in our practices, in our coordination, and there's no rule to tell us how. Okay, very briefly. So I'm interested in sort of seeing, in particular, in a majority of cases, that concepts are part of systems, social systems, and they have particular functions in enabling us to organize ourselves in these systems. So in some cases of amelioration, we should look to the function of a concept to determine how to proceed. What functions does this concept serve? I'm not claiming that we construct concepts with purposes in mind or that concepts have a proper function. I'm not doing teleosemantics. And I'm not saying also that all concepts are functional concepts in a sense like a heart or a carburetor or something like that, that all concepts have as their content some functional notion. That's not the point. I'm talking about the function that these dispositions have. They have a set of, these dispositions we have play a role in our organizing ourselves into social systems. And I'm relying on a systems conception of function rather than a purposive or ideological. So some people call it a Cummins conception as opposed to a Millikan conception of function. So according to a systems approach, features of a system, an engine or circulatory system, are explained by workings of its subparts, the carburetor and the heart. We decide on what system and what features of the system we're interested in, and the same thing can function differently with respect to different systems. So for example, consider a school. A school is most often considered a part of the educational system. And you see it as many different levels of education, elementary and secondary and college. It's also part of a neighborhood. Schools change real estate values because people want to live in neighborhoods where there are good schools. They also are places where people gather, where adults get to know each other, where often they're used for after, evening meetings and things like that. And they also function, at least in the United States, in legal and social services systems. So the school nurse plays a crucial role in determining whether there's a suspicion of domestic violence or child abuse, and whether a child is in need of food. It's also increasingly the case that in the US, there are police attached to schools or security guards attached to schools, and people who bring guns to schools are arrested or whatever. Okay, so that's just the idea that we don't need to assume when we're looking at the function of a concept that there's a proper function that we're mostly interested in, but this is the idea of a Cummins function. So the school has a Cummins function in all of these different systems. Okay, so let's look at families as an example. Because we process certain kinds of information, mainly for the purpose of coordination, we can judge the adequacy of how we do so by reference to how well the coordination works. So better and worse concepts of family can be evaluated in terms of how having the relevant dispositions to respond to a particular content enables us to achieve coordination around intimacy, child rearing, and economic collaboration. So when you say, look, having this conception of family, we have a lot more difficulty raising children and to making sure children have safe and places to live with loving adults around them. And so our conception of family is failing us. We need a different conception of family. For example, and I think this is true of including adoptive families. So, back in the day, adoptive parents, adoption wasn't a way to constitute a family. But now when you see, well, what happens to children if their biological parents cannot support them, they go into these foster care systems, or they get sold as slaves, or they become indentured servants or something. That's a terrible way to coordinate when there are adults who would be happy to take them in. So our concept of family changed so that we can have legal adoption, so that we can have adults be family to children that they're not biologically related to. And that's a better way to organize things because, children are able to thrive under those conditions that they wouldn't have been able to thrive under in other conditions. And in this case, sometimes epistemic amelioration is not enough because we need to modify what counts as a family to include same-sex or adoptive families. We can also change on moral grounds, and I believe that the organization of family life is a matter of justice. Should we count as real families only those constituted by heterosexual couples and their biological offspring? No. I think our concept of family can be evaluated with respect to whether it facilitates coordination on morally acceptable terms, and to say that same-sex families or adoptive families are real families, so they don't get the benefits that legal families get, is a moral wrong. So we can extend it also for that reason. Okay, so note that the partition of logical space that we should be collectively tracking and how we tracking may be very different from the one that we are currently tracking. This provides a basis for allowing ameliorative accounts to be a way of improving the content of our concepts and not just replacing them. Concepts or orientations are part of the cultural techne that keep a social system running because they focus our attention on features of the world around us, which we coordinate, the world around which we coordinate and call for approved responses. If the system is flawed, a concept may be the source of the flaw because action in accordance with it entrenches injustice. So I've got the image is, yes, we've got something in our head, but our head takes information from the cultural techne that is shared, that is common, etc. And sometimes we need to change the cultural techne, and that's going to involve changing also the dispositions that people have to respond to the world and each other. Okay, so conclusion. We have an interest in carving logical space in order to coordinate with each other, to draw distinctions that serve our purposes as social beings, and to realize our values. How best to do this changes as we develop new technologies and as we come to appreciate new and different values. When social change happens, there's likely to be controversy and disagreement about how to extend the concepts we've been using to do the work we now need them to do. Such changes should be acknowledged as such and should not be held hostage to what we have thought we were doing all along and how to continue that. So this is to say, we need to acknowledge that sometimes we know more than we did before. And so what we thought we were talking about is not what we're talking about because we have epistemically ameliorated. And sometimes we have to change what we're talking about. And we don't just need to continue calling a family or calling a meter what we had before. Our conceptual framework should be forward-looking and give us the tools to envision and create better lives together. Thanks for your attention. I'll let you read that because I want to educate people about gender.
That was awesome. Thank you very much. So yeah, we have quite a bit of time for questions. So I don't know if, I guess, Fido.
Hi, Sally. Thank you so much for your talk. So I was wondering the following. Probably you can give me some light on this. So how does realism about social categories look like after using amelioration? Because it seems that it's a bit mind dependent. I don't know if you can if you can tell me if there are problems with thinking of social contents or social contents that play with social contents that paint a picture of contents. So I just want to know if realism is in problems.
So I think that there are all kinds of mind-dependent things that are real and objective. Cities. We wouldn't have cities unless there were minds who built them. We wouldn't have any technology at all if there weren't. And so mind dependence for me has very little to do with the sort of the mind dependence, mind independence, objective, non-objective, real, not real. I mean, those distinctions don't mean that much to me. So there's lots of things that we create that are perfectly real. There are lots of things, and part of my work has been to suggest that how we think about the social world has an impact on reality, and changes people's bodies and changes people's prospects and opportunities in very material ways. So there's no reason to think that just because something is mind dependent, it's not fully objectively real. But I think I might be missing something. Can you elaborate a little?
Yeah, so at least in the discussion that I know about, some people do try to fight for an agenda of mind independence, but yeah, as you were saying, the dependence that these social elements have regarding the mind are it's omnipresent. So I agree with you that probably we shouldn't care much about these distinctions. But you already answered me when you were.
Yeah. Okay. So the mind independent. So there's a great paper by Gideon Rosen called. God, what is that paper called? What is the question? Modern. Oh my God. I'll put it in the chat.
Modern idealism.
Oh, objectivity and modern idealism. Right. It's 1994. I can put it in the chat. And Steve and I taught a seminar on objectivity a few years ago, and I was really hardcore about this. Now I've come to kind of closer to what he thought about it. But anyway, so I tend to think that that as long as you have truths in a domain, that's sufficiently realist for my purposes. I'm not really interested in, oh, thank you. I'm not really interested in old-fashioned sort of objectivity, old-fashioned realism as mind independence. People can go worry about that, but I don't think there's a very valuable question there. So I'm maybe it's deflationary about all that kind of stuff. But it's certainly the case that the world consists in a lot of mind-dependent things, as I understand mind dependence.
Awesome, thank you. Jaime?
Yeah, thanks so much for the talk. So I think I kind of agree and sympathize with the picture of concepts of being able to change the content, thinking of them as like things that don't have their content essentially. And in that sense, that's, if I understood correctly, that's one way of avoiding the charge of changing the subject, because you're still using the same concept and the same word, because it's just it's changing the meaning or something like that. But can we say that the challenge can also be put in, you're changing, because you said you're changing what you're talking about or the subject, and so can that be identified with the content or the property, let's say? So in that sense, we are changing the property, right?
Yeah. So that's helpful. That's a really good question. I think that when we're talking, my own thinking about subject matter, and I dare not say anything with Steve here, but I will, is that there's a way of thinking about subject matter when you're thinking about, you're not thinking necessarily about the informational content, right? You're thinking about a set of questions and what are the answers to that set of questions, etc. But I think you're right that something does change. And I'm hesitant to say the property changes unless you are a class nominalist. So you think that any set of things is a property, because we're not always, it's not always the case that I think you could have, well, depends what you think properties. If you have a view about properties that has no restriction, then yes, you are changing the property. And
I was using property to refer to what you call partitions.
Yeah, you're changing that. That's for sure. You are changing that.
I see.
You're changing the informational content, you could even say, because you're changing the partition.
So you just accept that consequence of the picture. All right.
Yeah, because that's what I'm trying to argue is possible, right? I want to, an informational content is just the set of things, and so I want to be able to say that, yeah, no, you can change that and still have the same concept or the same meaning or the same word.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Eduardo?
But that's helpful to point that out.
Eduardo, and then I'm putting myself on the line, but I can't raise my hand. So Eduardo.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sally, for the talk. So I guess my question is related to Jaime's question. So I was wondering, why is it important to keep the same concept even though we change the content? So what is at stake there? Because here's the way I was thinking about it. So for example, you can have very different ways to approach to language. You can do empirical research and try to give a semantics that is an empirical project, how people use certain words. Okay, and that's a valuable thing to do. But also you can have another kind of project, something along the lines of what Quine calls regimentation, which is, I don't care what speakers think their words mean or what the words mean. We are in the enterprise of building a language that is optimal for the scientific enterprise. And that's why we rely on logic and all that stuff. So, and that's a very valuable thing, I guess, even though we are not doing empirical research, right? So couldn't one just say, well, look, why try to keep, why is it important to say, well, we're talking about the same concepts, but even though they can change our content, why not just say, look, here's a network of concepts that allow me to explain the world better than your network of concepts, or here's a network of concepts that gives me as a result a more morally acceptable way of thinking about the world, for example. And I don't care whether that's what people have in mind when they talk about marriage or whatever. Here's the way you should think about the things. And the reason why this is the way we should think about these things is because we have moral reasons, and you give your moral argument as to why it's better to change the concept. Why not do that?
Okay, so there are a couple of reasons. So one is that I am embedded in social movements, and I am not committed to a scientific enterprise which tries to do ideal theory. And there are a lot of reasons why I don't. One is that I don't trust people doing ideal theory to have good judgment about what's happening and what we need. I don't trust them to have good moral judgments about what's right and wrong. And I don't think, that includes moral theorists. I don't trust moral theorists to do that. And I think that the challenges that face us are ones that we encounter in a historically specific and contextually specific moment, and how we need to proceed depends on the history of the language, on the particular circumstances of the people engaged, etc. And to think that we could do that a priori in some way just strikes me as implausible. And so I am embedded, and I think the only way to do politically meaningful work is to be embedded. And so that's what's at stake for me. So for example, if we want a new word for something, and we're in a community that's multilingual, and we have meanings that, roots of words that are shared and other roots that are not shared, then it's going to be better for us to be sensitive to the particular historical linguistic pressures on members of that community to figure out how we should go on when we're trying to express something that is a shared content. And nobody can figure that out a priori, right? That's a particular historical question in a community about how to proceed. It's not something that is you can come up with an ideal theory and say, oh yeah, ideally speaking, blah. Then I'm saying, well, that's pointless. I don't care what the ideal theory has. And besides, in doing all the ideal theory, you're drawing on your own impulses and instincts and linguistic background and contextual, experience. So I just don't, I'm not saying that people can't do a certain amount of linguistics, but I can't even stand linguistics, because so much of linguistics depends on, oh, that sounds right, or that doesn't sound right. Oh yeah, I would take that to imply this, and I would take that and I would infer that. And I'm saying, well, yeah, but who are you, right? You're some highly educated white man, and you don't know anything about what people say on the street. Why should we trust you? Anyway, so sorry, I'm ranting a bit. Does that address your question?
Yeah. No, I'm not thinking, well, yeah, I understand where you're coming from. Perfectly, I think. But what one could say, sure, but I agree with that. But you have an ideal when you do theory, when you do philosophy, when you publish your work. You have a very clear idea of what you think is just, what you think is unjust, what you think is morally right, what you
Sure,
think is
sure,
morally
Yeah.
right.
Sure,
So
Yeah.
and you call your project conceptual amelioration. So it's not like you're
Sure.
taking what is there, right? So for
Right,
that reason, okay.
But I'm embedded. I mean, it's not just me alone. It's like I'm in a movement that takes this to be, I mean, we're fighting for a particular moral position and political position against people who don't agree with us. And we're not saying, oh, we won't have a conversation with you or learn from you, although it sometimes seems that way. Anyway, on some things, I'm not going to learn, right? On some things, I'm sorry, there is no correction, that women are full moral subjects, for example. No correction possible on that from my point of view. But what I'm trying to say is, yes, we are embedded and we're trying to make a case, and we're trying to, for a particular political understanding of the world, and we're trying to get people to see that. But that doesn't mean that we have the power to make it so, right? This is a move in a sequence of contestations that people push back. I mean, believe me, I'm very well aware of the pushback. And so it's part of a political process. That's all I'm saying. And so it's not trying to dictate or claim absolute authority or certainty about any of these things. These are all, any publication is a move, from my point of view, in a political kind of contestation to make the world better. And it may or may not work. It may fall, fall short in so many different ways. But I'm not merely a scientist describing the world. I am a player.
I see. Thanks very much.
Or I'm trying to be. I'm doing the work, right? This is part of the movement work.
I see. Thanks very much.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and ask my question, then we have Gabby. And so I have a question. I feel like maybe I'm still having trouble understanding the veterinarian child having different concepts. So I guess what I was thinking was that, so for example, in the case of whale or any of those in which we want to say like, look, there's the same concept, but maybe the content's changed. In those cases, like, it seems like the reason we want to preserve that, right, is also a thing of like, yeah, we're kind of talking about the same thing in some sense. And the concept, like, that plays that role for us, right? It allows for that kind of continuity. So I guess I was wondering, in the case of it seems like there's not much at stake at saying like, look, the same concept had a different content before and now it has this content. Like, it's fine, we can still understand each other, we can still like talk that way. So I was thinking, I guess in the veterinarian and the kid case, thinking about dogs, that there's a sense in which, yeah, they have different concepts, but I was wondering if there's
different conceptions. They have different conceptions.
Sorry, they have different conceptions of dog. Oh, maybe I wasn't understanding do they have different concepts of?
No.
They have different dispositions.
The same
interpretation of dog.
They have the same concept, but different conceptions.
Okay. So you still have the concept playing that same kind of unificatory role, but okay. I guess what I was thinking, I had thought. Now I'm not quite sure why they don't have different concepts of dog. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think they're different kinds. So this might or may not be helpful, but sometimes I think the priority is the things in our environment, right? So these things, we're talking about these things. He's right here. Okay, Sparky, come on. Okay, I'm talking about these things, right? There's a Sparky dog, I'm talking about these things, right? And, we could find out all kinds of things about these things that we didn't know before. And the concept would be of these things. you know, these sweet things. Okay, go back to sleep. Okay. And so it might be whales, you know, those big, huge things in the sea that they used to, you know, get oil from and whatever like that. That's what the whales are. And then you go, well, you know, they're not fish, they're mammals. And you go, okay, they're mammals, but it's those things that we're talking about. And so there are some cases where that's what's going on. And there are other cases that seem a little more de dicto, right? Our understanding of it, our attitude toward it is a bit de dicto. And so too much change in how you think about it is not permissible. But I think that when you're talking about dogs, the vet and the neighbor and me and you and everything, we know dogs, right? Dogs are those things that I just showed you. And so that's shared, right? We can all pick out the dogs from the cats and the dogs from the, you know, the street lights and things like that. So that is shared between us. Why should we say, oh no, it's not? Does that help at all?
Yeah, so I guess what I was thinking is that, so there's going to be there's some things that the veterinarian is going to identify as dogs that the child is going to fail to identify as dogs, right? But still we want to say—
Yeah, probably not. I mean, the places where it gets tricky is in the imagination, in the thought experiments. I don't think the vet and the kid are going to, I mean, maybe wolf, you know, but most of the time in everyday life, they're not going to diverge at all. What's going to get tricky is when you have, you know, a science fiction, and is it a dog or is it not a dog? That's where things get funky. This is a Wittgensteinian point. You know, in everyday life, we get along fine. And that's why Wittgenstein didn't like thought experiments and going off and doing moral theory by thought experiments. He says, well, you know, our concepts go on vacation or whatever he said. What did he say? Steve, you remember that. On holiday.
Yeah, that's helpful. I guess, yeah, I completely agree that if there's no difference in how the distinction is made, then yeah, it's crazy to talk about a difference in concept. That's super helpful. So I have Gabi and then Eduardo and Victor.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Sally, for your very nice presentation. I'm going to ask a question that I think is a bit basic, and maybe it's clarificatory in that sense too. As I was trying to like synthesize for myself the main thesis, the main argument or the main points, more or less the moral I got from the story is, well, look, the question as to whether we're changing the concept and replacing it, it's kind of normative in a sense, right? Broadly speaking, it's normative. Sometimes we want to say we are, sometimes we want to say we're not, and it depends. And I'm really sympathetic to that. And at some point, my question became, okay, but who wouldn't be fine with this? Like, what would be the opposing view? Would it just be content essentialism about the concepts, or is there like a more articulate position from which you would be resisted? I'm just asking like that, like what would be the opposing view?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of people who are content essentialists, and they think that, you know, and I think that conceptual, I mean, they think that conceptual amelioration in this semantic sense is not possible. In fact, Louise Antony just gave a talk at the APA, and I heard her when she presented it as a draft, and she said you know, she started off saying, I'm going to show that conceptual amelioration is, and conceptual engineering in general, is impossible, and even if it were possible, it would not be necessary. Well, she has a Fodorian view about concepts, and so she, you know, thinks that most concepts are innate, right? And they're just there, and you can't change them. And I'm going, okay, you know, fine. Well, we're talking about different things. So part of what I'm doing here is trying to describe a different conception of concepts and how that conception of concepts fits in with a kind of social theory that makes it seem as though amelioration is not only possible, but it's relevant to social change. Because another thing that people will say sometimes is, oh yeah, like Kaplan, oh yeah, well, philosophers can sit in their study and, you know, make up all kinds of stuff, but it doesn't change the world. And I think that's a confusion too. So what I'm trying to do is sort of sketch a picture that is very different from a lot of people's pictures about language and mind and the world, to show how there's a certain way of understanding this where it does matter how we define our terms. It matters how we define marriage. It matters, and that politically it matters, because you want to be able to say in good faith, no, we didn't change the concept of marriage. And then this is the concept of marriage, right? Or something like that. And believe me, I know that that's not going to convince many people, but I think that there's political stakes here as well. Does that help?
Yes, absolutely. Now it's a bit more clear. I would only ask, I also see how, I mean, well, maybe your answer is going to be simple in this case, because you're against having a rule for everything. So my question was going to be, how should we handle cases in which there might be legitimate political motivations for going both ways, right? There could be a good reason for keeping it. There could be a reason to say, just bin that and like, let's move forward. And it's not clear to me like how it would be solved, but I suppose it doesn't have to be clear though.
Yeah, no, it's never going to be clear. I
Thank
think. I mean, I think this is a matter of judgment and good argument and deliberation, and then contestation. And also, I mean, I should say, so Ari Koslow is at the University of California, Irvine, and she wrote a wonderful thesis on conceptual amelioration, doing a lot of historical linguistics and sort of coming up with some desiderata sort of what the conceptual ameliorator ought to be paying attention to when maybe they're not desiderata, but rules, you know, kind of maxims for how to be a good conceptual ameliorator. And there are definitely mistakes that you can make given just historical linguistics. And there are pitfalls that you have to be sensitive to. And so she has, I don't know, I think she just had a paper come out in Synthèse, or it's coming out in Synthèse, that talks about this. And it's really a lovely, you know, addition to this conversation. Koslow, K-O-S-L-O-W.
Thank you very much.
Edward?
Hello, Sally. That was a very interesting talk. Thank you.
Sure.
So I was wondering about the scope of conceptual amelioration and whether it would be possible that this kind of content essentialism might be true of some kind of concepts. For example, I don't know, like phenomenal concepts or something like that. Maybe in those cases, you want to say that you can conceptually engineer those concepts. So what do you think about that?
So can you give me an example?
Yeah, so I was thinking, for example, the concept of, for example, one may try to say that the concept of pain is not susceptible to conceptual engineering, and you cannot change that concept in the sense that it's referent in whatever sense of reference is essential to that concept, and you cannot change the content of that concept.
Well, it's tricky. So I'm thinking about Elizabeth Barnes' work in the minority body, and about how she has looked at ways in which people who live with chronic pain come to find that pain not aversive. They come to see the pain as offering something positive in their lives. Now that seems to me to be tricky. I also remember when I had surgery once long ago and I was on morphine, and someone called me on the phone and said, "Are you feeling much pain?" And I said, "You know, I can't feel anything, but I think I'm in pain because I can't stop crying." And, you know, it's just really tricky to me how we want to, and because pain is also something that there seems to be this pragmatic orientation to, of trying to relieve, that if someone or something is in pain, then there's kind of a moral assumption that one ought to try to relieve it.
Right.
But part of the work in disability studies is maybe trying to relieve pain is the wrong way of proceeding. It's not a good assumption. And that because et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I don't know. So I'm just thinking off the top of my head here about not being that clear myself what is in the informational content of the term pain, and it's being very morally loaded.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not
No,
sure.
no, thank you. You know, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Victor?
I have a question about the notion of coordination that you mentioned in your presentation. Because as I understand coordination, at least in certain frameworks, it happens when the players win in case the other player win, and they lose otherwise. So I understand why, for example, communication can be a game of coordination. But in the case of social interactions, I was thinking maybe not all social interactions aim at coordination. And some of them, and maybe conceptual engineering is an example of just non-coordination in social interactions, right? For example, the case you gave about people talking about marriage and the different definitions, it's like, in metaphorical terms, they want to change the rules of the game, or each participant has different rules for the game, and they don't even coordinate on what's the game going to be or the architecture of the game. So yeah, I don't know if it's a good interpretation of what you
so
said,
I
but...
think that the game theorists have stolen the word coordination for their purposes. And so I don't want to restrict myself to what they call coordination. I think that we coordinate in lots of different ways, not always around rules, for example. I think animals coordinate, and there's not always rules there, and the payoff matrix and the, all that stuff is just a formal model for certain activities of coordination, but it's not a model of human or animal interaction on the whole, and it presupposes a lot of social context in order to even get off the ground. So if you see the evolutionary game theorists, I think a lot of them are willing to grant that game theory, it's not, you can't start from scratch, right? There has to be either a biological cognitive predisposition in some ways, or a social predisposition to get things off the ground. And so I'm interested in those, I want to include in coordination some of those prior conditions which make possible the more elaborate architectures of choice and preference and such like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And maybe it wasn't clear for me what was the role of resources also. So not only coordination but coordination about with respect to the resources that the participants have or the members of society, etc. Because it also seems that not everyone has the same resources and they act with different resources to begin with. So maybe, yeah, it's just.
Yeah. So what I'm thinking, again, I'm at the social level rather than the individual level. So take for example that a community needs water. And so this is something that is valued in the community, right? It's a positive thing that people seek, is water. Some people have a lot of it, some people have none of it. You know, some people have power to restrict others from getting it and all those sorts of things. And so the question is going to be, how do we organize ourselves in response to water? And it may be that we have an instinctual, you know, humans have an instinct to drink water or to seek water or whatever. I don't know what that is. But that could be the basis for thinking that water is a resource, if there's something instinctual there about that. But then the question is, how do we organize ourselves to get it, to not waste it, to share it, to do all of those sorts of stuff? And that's where the cultural technique comes in. So we need to find a path to the water. Maybe some people are really good at finding it, and some people, so we divide labor around it. And then some people are good at using it to make food, and other people are using it to flush wounds and, you know, things like that. So we start dividing labor in the acquisition of water, in the use of water, and all of those sorts of things. And that's where the cultural technique comes in. And that's where power happens, because people who don't have water, they're going to be under the thumb of the people who do have water, and etc. So I don't know. So I'm influenced quite a bit by, oh, I have the book right here. It's a wonderful book. Let's see if I can put it right in my head. Yeah, The Origins of Unfairness by Kaylin O'Connor, Social Categories and Cultural Evolution. And she uses game theory, but not from scratch. She's already presupposing that there's some sort of a cultural techne is what I would call, or a set of social practices that are kind of already in place. And there's a set of agreed upon understanding of resources. And then what happens, and it's about how power, in particular, how gendered power emerges very easily from that. Does that help?
Yeah, a lot. Thanks.
Jaime?
Yeah, thank you. I have another question. So I can't stop thinking about something like this, and I wonder if this is relevant or compatible with your kind of view. You think that concepts are dispositions, meaning that to have a certain kind of concept is to be disposed to blah, blah, blah. And possibly the kind of thing you're disposed to is to have some kind of relation to a property, like identifying the property in a certain way or something like that. And you might think we have tons of concepts, like depending on how you describe that relation to the property, or with what you have tons of dispositions. So then, for instance, that distinction between concepts and conceptions might be just a difference in the kind of dispositions we're interested in, right? So there's not like a deep thing that is a concept that distinguishes it from a conception or something. It's just how we want to classify these positions. How do you feel about that kind of picture?
Totally. So like I have, so I think that I share certain dispositions with a lot of other people around distinguishing dogs from non-dogs, but I happen to be a dog lover. And so my dispositions around dog are very peculiar to me, right? I mean, well, they're, first of all, they're common to other dog lovers, and then they're common to other dog owners, because, you know, I'm disposed, and then there's some that are just peculiar to me, right? I'm disposed to tickle them on their tummies or something like that. And so it gets more and more and more fine-grained and idiosyncratic. And so you can have these conception at different levels of specificity. But then there are the ones that are more the approved of kind. So the way I'm trying to distinguish it is there's this very broad one, dogs, non-dogs. Then there's the very peculiar ones. It's Sally's conception of dogs, right? Or Sally's dispositions are very peculiar to her. And then there's this, well, the vet. I mean, you go to school to develop a certain set of dispositions toward dogs, and you get licensed because you have those sort of dispositions toward dogs. And that's the orientation.
Good. Yeah. Can I add just something quickly and see if this is also making sense? You can also distinguish like a direct disposition towards a certain property and the dicto, which is something like having that kind of relation to whatever property is that satisfies this kind of role. And that might be the thing that persists, you know, through time with having being connected to different properties. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I think.
Thank you.
Eduardo, and then I also have another question.
Okay, so let me ask you again about these positions, because one of the motivations for people to go to these positions is precisely to get rid of representational contents as representations of the world, right? So your machinery, your semantic and meta-semantic machinery is representational. You have propositions, you have aboutness, you have ways for the world to be, and you have partitions, right? All the representative propositional machinery. But your notion of concept is dispositional. So, and that, I think I'm missing the link there, because usually people who says, who rely on dispositions say things like, oh, forget about that representational accounting. We are not representing the world. To have a belief is not to have a mental representation of a way the world might be, is to have a disposition to act, for example. So there's no representational content. We are not representing the world. We're disposed to act in a certain way. That's usually the way many people respond to this representation. So I was wondering whether you so I'm not so sure how you are putting in one picture both approaches that might be very different to contents.
Okay, so I think that this is so there in the semantics, words have informational content, right? And so words, in a sense, are representational in that sense that they have informational content. But to know what the word means, or to use the word meaningfully, is to have a set of dispositions. And I guess I don't see how there's a tension there. why I was saying it, I think it maybe is a question about the meta semantics, is how does the word get this informational content? And maybe there's some idea that, well, it gets that informational content because what we have in mind. But that's not how I'm thinking about how words get informational content. I'm thinking that there's going to be, you know, a pattern of use that gets extrapolated in certain ways across possibilities. There's going to be some actual, you know, scientific externalists, there's actually some kinds of unity that unifies the set of things that we seem to be responding to in this way, and blah, blah, blah. So but I don't see anything in principle kind of at, you know, it's not that words don't represent, but it's they don't represent by virtue of having a cognitive sort of vehicle of representation. That's what I think, that's why I take this view to be doing. So it's back to the Fregean, anti-Fregean kind of view. Fregeans think that you have to, you know, there's some intermediary between the, you know, which is this sense or whatever. And I take it that that's what this view is trying to do without.
I see. So, well, the way I'm thinking about it, maybe this might help. So if you're a representationalist and you think the propositions represent a way the world might be, then, for example, for a sentence, for the sentence, there is a table in front of me, to be true, there must be a table in front of me, right? It's representing a way the world is. The world is such that there's a table in front of me, right? So that's the standard pictures, let's say. On the dispositional picture, you might think, well, no, there's no such thing as the way the world is. What you have is a bunch of dispositions, right? And I have the disposition, a disposition in such a way that is best described as there's a table in front of. But the content is not. I have a bunch of behaviors, a bunch of okay.
I don't know why. I mean, I don't know why you would say that. Why would it,
well,
why do you think that I'd be committed to something like that?
Well,
we have language, we have an apparatus, we have traffic lights, you know, red means stop and green means go. I don't know why I have to deny that.
Right, no, I agree with you. I'm just saying red means stop because people are disposed to act in that way, right? It's not because it is representing a feature of the world. It's because we are disposed to stop when we see something red or a red light, and when
no, but
when
we're
we
disposed to stop because red means stop.
Right.
I mean, the order of explanation seems backwards in that view.
Okay, so it means stop in the dispositional lingo would be we're disposed to behave in that way. Okay.
No, I don't think so at all. No, things can have content without it just being reducible to dispositions.
I agree with that. I mean, I'm a propositionalist in that way. I was just trying to see whether we need dispositions at all. So why not just work with content, just content and partitions of.
Why do we stop when we see a red light?
Why? Because we have a convention that says
The
that
convention doesn't make me stop.
if I agree, if I abide by the convention, the social convention, that
What counts as abiding by a convention?
behaving in a certain way systematically.
Being disposed to behave in a certain way.
Okay, I see. I see. Okay, so you're not reducing. So you have aboutness, and that's the representational content, but you what you have different dispositions, meaning you tend to behave in different ways, or even though you have the same content. Is that?
Well, it depends. So it depends on your. So yeah, I behave differently toward dogs than other people behave toward dogs, but there's some similarities in my behavior toward dogs. And I behave differently toward red lights than other people do. You know, I mean, we vary, but we all know that you're supposed to stop at a red light. Some of us do and some of us don't. So the dispositions, the individual dispositions become very complicated. So I think there's two separate questions. One is how does red come to mean stop and pink come to mean pink? That's the metasemantical question. And then once it does mean that, what is involved in knowing that, and what is involved in using that apparatus for communicating? So I think there's different questions here. I'm mostly interested in what is it to know the apparatus and to use it for communication. And the dispositional stuff is mostly that. I know I grasp the concept or the meaning or whatever. To say that is to say that I have this set of dispositions. I use it to communicate because I assume that someone else knows the convention or has those sorts of dispositions, and we coordinate our behavior in light of that. I haven't really said anything about how the representation, how the metasemantical question of how this apparatus comes to have this content. I haven't said anything about that. And I haven't, but it does. So, and I could say something about it, but not very much. I could say about that. But that I'm relying on, you know, other people who've taken a kind of externalist approach to that rather than making it up myself.
I see. So this to be shared. Only.
Sorry, say it again. You broke up.
Oh, so you share content. Dispositions don't have to be shared.
Well, if we both know the content, then we do share them.
Oh. So
we share the disposition to divide things into dogs and non-dogs. So to have the concept of dog is to be disposed in the right circumstances to differentiate dogs and non-dogs. That's something that everybody who has the concept of dog does. That's a shared disposition in response to things in the world. And that's what it is to have the concept of dog.
I see. But the difference, the example you gave between water and beverage, picking up the same.
Water and H2O?
No, water and beverage.
Water is a beverage. H2O
yeah.
is a chemical.
Right. But they're worlds in water, a beverage.
Sorry, you're breaking up. So there,
So,
I was
so-
suggesting it might be that there's a world there, we evolve in such a way over time, not now, but over time, is though not all H2O is a beverage. And so not all H2O is water. Because water, as things evolve, continues on with the beverages subject matter, where H2O continues on with the chemical subject matter.
I see. Okay, that's helpful. Thanks.
Sorry.
I think we're at time, so I think this is a good place to stop for the recording. Thank you very much, Sally, for your talk and for all of your answers and discussion. It's been amazing. So yeah, I don't know if we could have a round of applause for Sally.
Thank you so much for your questions. And I'm learning a lot just from being pressed in these ways. So I really appreciate, if I've misunderstood, I apologize. I'm trying to sort of make sense of my own view. This is, I hope this happens to others too, but you say things and then you don't even know for sure what you meant. And then you have to have people ask you questions in order to know what you mean. So thank you. Thank you for that.